philosophy and the text we've been studying. So far, right, when we're talking about concrete things in Augustine, we have the two definitions of commonwealth, right? And the sort of upshot of this is Cicero's definition says it's a community around justice, and what Augustine does that's really important, and I would just write this down because I think this is kind of my attempt to draw it all together. Augustine's point is that it's just an association of people gathered around a love, right? And that love can be good or bad. It's a spectrum, okay? And so he has this really famous passage, and you guys will probably hear it. He tells an anecdote. If you ever keep reading in these areas, he tells an anecdote about Alexander the Great and the pirate. And in this anecdote, Alexander captures a pirate, and he shackles him and he chides him for being a pirate. And the pirate says, well, honestly, you and I aren't that different, right? You're a government, but you're a pirate too, right? We do the same thing. We are spreading terror, and we are stealing things. It's just that you have an official title to do it. And so, whether you're talking about a state or a private actor, if they're both acting like tyrants, this one doesn't have more of a privileged state or more of an authority for Augustine. The other thing that you have is the three loves, and we kind of hit that over and over again. But you have the love of the good or God, and remember we talked, to explain this part, we talked about, I drew that line on the board from Plato. It was called the divided line. That's in your module, and kind of a story of ascent, right, to the good. And the really important thing to come away with from that is that anything that exists is good, right, because it exists. When something turns away from what is good, it turns away from existence. But as long as it has existence, there is some good there. And I want you to hold on to that point. The other thing is lust for domination, or the libido dominandi, and love of glory. And you guys did a really good job of talking about these attributes. And one thing we hit a lot with these two is that love of glory very easily devolves into love of domination, right? The other thing that is really important in Augustine is this idea of the two cities. And, you might wonder, well, why don't you start with the two cities? Because, the book is called The City of God, or one of the books we're dealing with is The City of God. But you kind of actually need to know about this before you really look at this. The city of God and the city of man. And it's like that quote I told you about from book 14, chapter 1. He says, across the world, you have many peoples. They're different races, different languages, different habits, cultures, costumes. He uses the word costume, but he means outfits. And he says, even though there's that diversity, it is all reducible to these two cities. And they're members of each of those nations and cultures in each city, okay? So what the distinction is, city of God, now you can sort of see why this whole discussion is so important. Members of that are formed around love of the good or God. A city of man, love of domination, love of glory. So all humans fall into either one of these camps, but you don't know, right, who is where. So Augustine doesn't think that you can look at a nation and say, that nation's a city of God, or that nation's a city of man. Even the Romans, he talks about the Roman Empire as being the city of man, but when you read the city of God, you see there's lots of Romans that are candidates for the city of God in his own language. You also can't identify the church with the city of God. He says that there are going to be members of the city of man in the church. Okay, so there's no sort of rubric, there's no ability. He thinks you cannot know who's in the city of God and who's in the city of man, because you can't know the intentions behind what people do, and you also don't know where they're going to end up. And that's part of why I like your point about Genu. Because for Augustine, life is a narrative, okay? And he calls his discussion of his life, his looking back on his life, he calls it a confession. And confession for them can mean like to confess what I've done wrong, but it also just means like a recounting, and it can also mean something like a statement of belief. And so each life has a narrative structure, a beginning and an end, and all these events that occur within that. And he thinks, basically, if he thinks, which we know he does, that anything that exists is good, that means even when someone is dedicated to these destructive things, there is still something in them that is connected to the good. And a lot of times what happens for Augustine is that it is through the events of life, right, that we can ascend to the good or we can descend. Because even a friendship, so let's use, even a friendship with someone who is not good in the way Augustine thinks of good, even that for him is going to be, it's not over. Because these people exist, right? Insofar as they exist, they participate in the good. And because friendship, real friendship, that thinks about the other person first in some ways is a good. Even people who are bad in some ways, they can make choices for a friend that are good. And if someone starts to follow that path or that invitation, they can get out of where they are. So basically for Augustine, the structure of reality is a constant set of invitations to the good, okay? So when Rumi and Genu are interacting, it seems really odd that the demon is the source of the solution that Rumi has that saves the world, that saves the Hanmun. But for Augustine, that wouldn't be that strange, in the sense that as long as there's existence, there's that possibility, okay? That choice. He talks about having friends, and he says these particular friends, they like encourage each other in all sorts of bad ways. But that looking back on that time in his life, they also did some really good things for each other. And one of the things they did that was really good for each other is that they really wanted what was good for the other person. So even while they're doing these chaotic, even while they're wilding, basically, as time goes on, they mature together. And they become very different men than they once were, right? Because over time, what was the continuous thing for them in their life was the love they had for each other. And as long as the love they had for each other was an important part of their life, it was going to call them into better and better ways of living. So for Augustine, then, I think another reason that he doesn't want to say that you can know who is where is that a lot of times what seems to be low or bad, actually, there's always some aspect of it that's still connected to what is good. And sometimes, even, it's the person who seems to be the most in the world of what is bad who could become good, right? You see that with Chinu because he's the one who sacrifices himself, right? Chinu's real story is he abandoned his family, his starving family, right? His mom and his sister. And that's what controls him is his guilt over doing that. And you have to admit that's a pretty shitty thing to do. I mean, I am hard pressed to think, there's bad things to do, lots of bad things to do. But training your family so you can be famous and eat a lot and you just leave them to starve and die, pretty bad, okay? Pretty bad. But somehow this person becomes the engine of not just Rumi's idea, but of being able to seal the Han wound forever, right? Because him dying to protect Rumi allows them to do what they need to do, right? So, to me, that's one of the most important aspects of Augustinian political philosophy. It seems very binary, okay? It seems pretty this or that. But when you remember that existence is always deriving from what's good, and just to draw it again, right? We talked about essay, which is being, right? And then you go up the divided line. This is the intelligible, this is the visible. Images, objects, formula, and forms, right? As long as you are in the realm of existence, there is that possibility of ascent. Which is why things like confession, like narrative, like checking in and saying, this is where I am now, are so important for him. It's also why he makes a lot of his arguments about political philosophy through history, okay? Let me see. Something else to add there. What did you think of the idea of the liberation from shame as playing an important role in just action? So that's a through line, right? So this is another important thing to think about in terms of Augustinian psychology. So, like, there's that line Genu has where Rumi goes, "You don't feel anything." And he goes, "What do you mean? All we do is feel." All we do is feel. Feel what?
Feel shame.
Feel our shame. Yeah. Our shame and our misery. Okay, so just as a side note, with Augustine in Western political philosophy, so starting with the Greeks, he is the first one to integrate the emotional life into the ethical life. It's not like people weren't emotional before, but their conception of reason and conscience was really different. And there's a popular ancient path, which has a lot of good things about it, but it also has some limits, and that's called Stoicism, right? Stoicism. And Stoicism just means sort of having a impassiveness to emotion. Well, it's so you can remain in control of yourself through reason. You can see how Stoicism, and I write down Stoicism as a concept, has benefits. But the problem with Stoicism for Augustine and what he does that kind of changes things in Western philosophy is he says, look, there's problems with Stoicism in the sense that there are times you are supposed to feel something. And he talks about this Roman general who has to fight a battle, and he is going to take the city. And the way he describes it, it's a war against an aggressor, and the general knows he has to take the cities. He knows he's going to kill enemy combatants. But he cries, he weeps. And Augustine says it was appropriate to weep, because even if these are enemy combatants, and of course this is in the context of their warfare, even if these are the enemy combatants and these are the rules of war, and he's within the rules of war, it is something that is lamentable to take anyone's life, right? Even if ostensibly the life is being taken in self-defense. So for Augustine, the idea that the moral life is disconnected from the emotional life is a big problem. Because what happens is then the moral life can actually quit picking up on injustices because your emotions can't pick up on them. Yes?
So Stoicism is where they don't feel anything?
Right, where your Stoicism, like I said, it has some benefits. It's where you're above the pain or even maybe the good things around you, in the sense that it's not supposed to disturb your interior calm, and it's not supposed to it's not supposed to mess with your reason. And so, like, I worked at the Naval Academy as a fellow for 1 year, and I worked at this place called the Stockdale Center. And Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war, and he got through it because he was a Stoic. Like, literally, that's why. He was a Stoic. And so his attitude towards pain and pleasure was the attitude of a Stoic. It got him through a lot of torture and pain and a really long period of imprisonment. Okay, and so that's why that center was founded. So there are benefits to it. But Augustine is saying, look, there are some times where your emotions are like, they're part of recognizing what's just and unjust. So there's a famous story of Princess Margaret, and this is a terrible story, but it's the one that comes to mind. She was inebriated. She had a really bad drinking problem. She drew a bath, and the water was boiling hot. She was out of it, And so she couldn't know how hot the water was. When she put her foot into the water, she started to get into the water, and she was in the water, she couldn't feel that it was burning her skin. Okay? So part of what Augustine is saying is, no, you need the emotions for the moral life. And so that is a big shift. His interest is in, if we need the emotions for the moral life, basically, what do we do with those emotions? This is his attempt to handle that. This question of what do you love? That's his attempt to handle that. What you love to him sort of is the thing your emotions operate around. Because if you're scared of something, it's not because you're scared, it's because you love something you're scared is going to is going to be hurt by whatever it is you're afraid of. And if you love if you're happy about something, it's because it's something to be happy about in relationship to what you love. And that's why he's so interested in these ideas about emotion, is because he thinks you need it to live the moral life, but we also just can't let it be totally uncontrolled, right? It can't be the thing that leads you. So when Genu says all we do is feel, that is like literally Augustinian demonology. For Augustine, the problem isn't that we have desire. For him, all of us are driven by desire. That is our primary way of engaging with the world. I would write that down. We are all driven by desire. That is the primary mode that we engage with the world, is through longing. And it's supposed to be that way for him, right? In his theology, it's a part of design. It's not a bad thing, though it can be bad. And for him, it becomes bad after the fall, or more complicated after the fall. But that longing is kind of our essence, I might say. Essence is wrong. A fundamental thing about us. So there's a famous line he has where he says, "My love is my weight. And where my weight goes is what carries me." So if my love is my weight, a way of saying that is like if you're a dancer and you have to do a step, you have to pivot, right? And turn a certain way. All of that is about shifting weight, right? It's all about shifting weight. And shifting weight is how you move, how you're carried. So for him, the whole way the human moves in the world is through love, through what they love. That is our weight. So then you can't have any political system or anthropology or psychology that doesn't start there, okay? But then the question is, okay, how do we refine that? How do we educate desire? Because, see, he thinks whether you want the love of domination or the love of the good or God, and I think he's right about this. Nobody ever wants something because they think it's bad. Nobody's yeah, that is so shitty, I really want it. What happens is there's something really shitty maybe that they really want, but to them, for some reason, it's good. Okay? This is even true for people who love something harmful. If you have someone who loves self-harm, for example, they love self-harm because it is harmful. But in the harmfulness, they have identified a good. And that good is the release that they get from self-harm. So there is no action any human commits that isn't for a perceived good. Demons and Genu, or people enthrall to these impulses Problem isn't that they feel, it's that it's all they do. He says, feel our shame, feel our misery. All we do is feel. Feel our shame, feel our misery. And you see with Ruby that, that's part of her story too. That's part of what holds her back, right? When she's able to shift her love from an area that's compelled by the shame to something else, right? She's able to become a better version of herself. And I think you see whether you're talking about Genu. So if we're talking about the apparent good, right, is the reason we all act, right? The moral life depends on the emotional life. So we talked about Rumi and Genu here. Then the sort of next thing to think about is to think about that analysis we just did about emotions in the moral life and combine it with what we learned about the fear of death. Okay. Because for Augustine, fear of death, it actually isn't bad. Okay, if anyone ever wants to read about this, I wrote a whole essay on it that got published in an Augustine volume. Fear of death isn't bad. He thinks it's natural, okay, because we're not supposed to want to die. Even if, from a theological perspective, even if he thinks, right, that there's a heaven and that there's nothing better than heaven, he thinks we were never meant to die. We were meant to be united to God forever, and then we had the fall. So nobody should be happy about death, and he actually says nobody should be looking for death, right? Like if you're going to be a martyr, that's good if you're being asked to be a martyr. But don't go and try to provoke someone into killing you so you can be a martyr, which there are people who did at the time. Okay, you're not supposed to be trying to die. In fact, you're supposed to be trying not to die. It's just that sometimes to stay alive, you're going to be asked to do something bad, right? And then you can't do that. But for him, it's normal to be afraid of death. The question is, going back to what we talked about when we talked about fear of death as a part of human motivation, so what does that make you do, right? What does that make you seek? We talked about people who seek glory or domination, basically, as a way of seeking control. It's a way of seeking control. And that is a path to destruction. So for him, then, it's the education of desire. And incidentally, in the Platonic tradition, music is a big part of educating desire. That's part of why the K-pop Demon Hunters being singers is kind of cool to me, as a political theory nerd. But so this is how all of this wraps up. And so if we're thinking about this from the perspective of political philosophy, remember this course is basically like a journey through different perspectives on how to deal with suffering and how to deal with human freedom in the face of suffering, right? We talk about themes of justice. And so what I want you to do here is to come away with this worldview, with this account of the world. And we'll look at other accounts of the world, but this is an important one to sort of put in your toolbox. Okay, this is one way of answering these questions about life. You're going to want to hold on to it. And the next thing we're going to study is Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's Prince is really interesting, totally different. A lot of times when Machiavelli's writing, he's trolling Augustine. I mean, Augustine's been dead for a really long time, but he's still trolling him. I promise. Like, it's like, have the concept of subtweeting. Like when you're aiming at something else by talking about a certain thing and making a certain argument, you're like, chipping away at another thing that's really in your sights. That is Machiavelli with Augustine. Okay. He's going to raise a lot of important points, a lot of important questions. He's going to give you another way of answering these kinds of questions. Okay. So, yeah. Any questions about it? I'm going to want you, I guess, I'll put on the module before the end of the day how far I want you to get through the Prince. But remember, the Prince is on PDF in Canvas. Okay, so you could just use that. So go ahead and turn in your questions for today to me. You'll have discussion questions for next time. And you can come and take pictures of these things here, okay? You guys have been doing a really, really good job. So thank you.